I'm joined now by Ben Domenench. He is the editor at large at The Spectator. He's a Fox News contributor. And every Friday we go through the week and look backwards. And I just have to begin, Ben. The vice president sat down with Stephanie Ruhle. It was her fifth interview in 60 days. Dana Bash, Brian Taft, the local Philly affiliate, the National Association of Black Journalists, Oprah, and now Stephanie Ruhle. She's really bad at this. What did you think of the Ruhle interview?
Well, one of the things that is a repeated and noticeable attribute of the vice president is that she gets twisted up and stumbles over the most predictable questions in the world. We're used to dealing with gotcha questions from journalists for people who are on the right. You expect them when you walk into interviews, and it's why if you have to really come prepared. It's what makes, frankly, J.D. Vance and Tom Cotton pretty impressive at this, in the sense that they can anticipate where people are going to go with questions and get out ahead of them, be prepared to answer them, and respond effectively. The vice president has none of that capability. And in fact, she stumbles up and gets twisted around on questions that are thoroughly predictable, obvious, things that, you can anticipate being asked of her, especially when it comes to questions about some of the central issues in this campaign as it relates to the economy, foreign policy, as it relates to the security of the border, et cetera. All things that she can anticipate are going to be asked of her by friendly interviewers and put in friendly context. And still, she can't manage to get through an interview without making a complete joke of herself and looking like someone who just started to get into politics yesterday, as opposed to being what she is, which is, of course, a lifelong politician who's been active at all these different levels and should be able to answer questions, especially from someone like Stephanie Ruhle, who literally was on Bill Maher the previous week, talking about Kamala Harris in a way that was extremely positive. And so I think that this is a situation where, unfortunately, she's not going to get any better anytime soon. And their decision to sort of do this to try to allay fears is having the opposite effect. Instead, it's putting her in a position of being someone who is incapable of even handling the friendliest of interviews and the most easily anticipated questions in the world.
Now, Ben Domenech, she's 0 for 5. And I said last night on Special Report, I think the ice is frozen over this. I do not think she can change people's opinion of her. But I want to hammer one thing down. I have been involved. I got the vote for my first president in 1976. I voted for Jerry Ford, worked on his campaign. I have followed every presidential election very closely. Since then, there has never been a less skilled communicator from either major party since 1976. And I feel pretty confident in asserting that. I can even remember George McGovern. We can go back the full 52 years because I can remember Nixon was pretty good in the interview setting and the press conference until Watergate overwhelmed him. But in a presidential campaign, he was very good. He had Roger Ailes. George McGovern was better than this. Mike Dukakis was better than this. This is the worst of any presidential candidate ever. Do you think I am right?
I think you are right. I think that she would be starving for any kind of slogan or anything that she could lean on. How's about this for a suggestion? How about whip inflation now? let's try that. Let's try that on for size.
You've got to explain to our youngs what that was Jerry Ford's button.
I actually have. I kid you not, Hugh. I have an original win button that I have that I'll show you next time you stop by the house. But it's one of these things that is so. It's so readily apparent that she is not ready for this job, and it's a different kind of defect than what we've experienced with Joe Biden. With Joe Biden, we have someone who doesn't know what's going on around him, who's clearly just completely incapable of being president at this moment, and it's sad on a certain level because this is someone who had a career in politics that led him to this point, and whatever you think about his policies, I think they're terrible. You can have some sympathy for someone who's aging in public and really shouldn't be in this job. In her situation, she is an extremely ambitious person whose ambition is completely out of step with the actual capability that she has to do the job. And communicating to the American people, inspiring the American people, having any kind of effect on the American hopes and dreams for the future is something that the media is completely manifesting about her that does not exist. And instead, I think, when you see some of these polls, for instance, the NBC poll that showed her popularity rising to heights unseen since George W. Bush stood on the rubble in front of the two towers and said that they'll be hearing from all of us soon. That's, to me, I just think that is not true. I don't see it. I don't hear it. I don't hear it from my Democratic friends. And I think that this level of inspiration that the media has put upon her as being something that she's brought to this race is entirely just a message of relief that they don't have to campaign with Joe Biden. It's not actually a testament to how good she is as a politician or as a
It's wish casting. She is losing altitude again. Debate briefly arrested her fall, but I saw last night in Arizona, the new Fox News poll shows her down 3 to Trump in Arizona. I think Arizona and Nevada are going to go for Trump. Georgia is to me alarmingly, and I doubt really competitive. I just, obviously they're going to be whacked. They're not going to be watching her at the border today. They're dealing with a hurricane. I want to go to Tuesday night. I talked about this with Megyn Kelly, which I'm going to play at the bottom of the hour, but I got to get your advice for J.D. Vance on Tuesday night, part 1. What, if you get 2 minutes with J.D. right now, what do you advise him to do?
I think that he needs to absolutely use the same tactics that he's been using in the press, in hostile interviews, to go after Tim Walz and to get under his skin. Because I think we've all seen that Walz has this temper, this capability to react when he feels like he's being challenged personally. It's something that we've heard from the people who've paid attention to him for a long time in Minnesota. And I think that there's a host of issues that JD can go after him on, both personally and on policy. But I would urge him to stick to the policy side of things, because that's where Walz is just such an extremist and has not been depicted as such in the media, where they've tried to, again, manifest this completely different picture of him as being a normal Midwestern person instead of the MSNBC dad that he is. And that's the kind of thing that I think that J.D. Vance is perfectly capable of doing, prosecuting the case against his policy prescriptions as being far too radical for the country. And I think that if he does it in the right way, it's going to lead to a moment that Walz will regret in terms of lashing out or firing back in a way that lets us see that temper, lets us see that aggression from him, and really puts a lie to the idea that he's just this nice, bumbling Midwestern father figure who can, in some ways humanize someone as out of touch as Kamala Harris and her, Berkeley, San Francisco ways.
Now, Ben, Megyn and I talked about this yesterday, Megyn Kelly. My advice, and Megyn concurred, and you haven't said this yet, maybe you do agree or don't agree. I don't care. Let's hear what you think. I think JD ought to be talking about Kamala Harris. It's a 90-minute debate. He'll talk for 40 minutes. He might want to try and gig Tim Walz once or twice, as you suggest. But I would say, that's a great question. But first, let me say Kamala Harris can't answer that because Joe Biden, and Tim Walz don't do this. Kamala Harris, Kamala Harris, Kamala Harris. In other words, I just would make Kamala Harris in every answer. What do you think?
Yeah, I think you're right about that. And the way to think about it, too, is this is an opportunity for him to prosecute the case against their candidates in a way that you're not going to get again this cycle in all likelihood. And so that's something that I think he can do quite capably. He's been showing it. I mean, he had a rough start. We obviously, so many things have happened this cycle, but, he really generated the least bump in terms of a VP choice of anybody. There were a lot of questions about him. He obviously was someone who was chosen in the context of the Biden ticket as opposed to someone who was going to have to run against Harrison Walz. And I think that he's proven, though, that he's gotten his feet under him now, and he's improved a lot, I think, as a soldier for Trump and for an agenda that, frankly, is far more about the priorities of the American people than anything that Kamala Harris is putting out there, and is in touch with them, as opposed to trying to essentially hand wave around all these different issues, saying, well, we're going to do all these new things that are going to represent change and that are going to benefit you. And, of course, the obvious question is, well, if you could do all those things, why aren't you doing them now?
I hope he says that repeatedly. Governor Walz, Kamala Harris has not done anything of the sort that you are recommending. She and Joe Biden unleashed 20% inflation over 4 years. I just want her to do it again and again and again. Ben is sticking around with me. Yep. When we come back on the other side, we're going to talk about Kamala's trip to the border. During the break, we're going to talk about the fact that the federal government does not build housing, cannot build housing at anywhere near efficient market-produced product. They need to get out of the way. Should know how to get out of the way. Stay tuned. Ben, I hope in this debate, Senator Vance gets a chance to talk about Kamala Harris's promise to produce 3 million housing units. I want to play cut number 14 from the MSNBC interview with Stephanie Ruhle.
It includes also what we must do to cut red tape. You're absolutely right. It takes far too long, and there's too much bureaucracy associated with home building. And I say that as a devout public servant. I know that we have to reduce the red tape and speed up.
Now, Ben Domenench, I was a lawyer for landowners and developers from 1989 to 2016 when I retired. In California, you have to deal with the California Air Resources Board, NEPA, and CEQA. You've got to deal with the Water Quality Control Board. You've got to deal with the California Department of Fish and Game. And there may be others if there are remediations. On the federal side, you have to deal with the EPA, the Army Corps of Engineers, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And this is all before you get to the local and county ordinances. Do you think she knows any of that? I mean, San Francisco is literally the worst place in America to build because you throw the Coastal Commission on top of that, and you're never going to build anything.
I do not think for one second that Kamala Harris is a yes in my backyard advocate. I just don't think it does not track at all. And one of the things that I think we have to understand about her at this point is that she's never going to come to any of these things with anything more than pablum. It's when she talks about it in the context of someone, who has had roles in government at every level, and has had the perfect ability to weigh in on these topics in ways that could actually have had an effect. And she hasn't done it. And why hasn't she done it? Because she doesn't actually care about it. She doesn't actually prioritize it. And I don't think that she actually knows how to have the kind of policy that we would need to put in place in order to have the level of housing units built that we need in America. But the thing that is really galling to me about this, again, is that she's in charge right now. She could have been working on this for the past 4 years. This could have been her project. I mean, if she was so scared of dealing with the border and being described as the borders are, then she could have weighed in and said, well, hey, look, I actually care more about housing for, Americans, and I'm going to make that my priority. Instead, it's just this hand-waving crap that is just completely out of sync with the kind of approach that she's had as a politician. And again, this is something that needs to be pointed out and that I hope J.D. Vance will point out in the debate.
I hope so as well. We're going to talk about the border when we come back on the network. But I got to ask you first, of the Dana Bash, Brian Taft, National Association of Black Journalists, Oprah, and Stephanie Ruhle interviews, which was the worst and which was the best, or are they all Fs?
I actually think that the worst may have been this Ruhle one. I think the best was probably the Oprah one, only because the Oprah audience is perhaps more amenable to a lack of any policy details. And so in that context, Kamala kind of works because it's just vibes. It's just, I care about you. I come from the middle class. I still think that that's a really weird thing to say when your father is a prominent professor and your mom is a research scientist. But I do think that one of the things that comes out of that interview is a softening of her for that audience. And so within that context, Kamala can kind of work. What is that context? That context is the softness of daytime TV, which is not what you actually want in a president. In a commander-in-chief, you want someone who perhaps is a little too hard for that, environment, where that's the exception, not the rule. And instead, I think that what we see from Kamala is that's her highest setting. That's as far as she can go. And I think that, in this context, in the context of a world that is experiencing war and chaos and threats all over the place, and a economy that is nowhere near as strong as it needs to be, and a border that is still porous and is being used.
Let's go to the border next. Pause for a moment. We'll be right back on the network, and we're going to talk about the border.
The Hugh Hewitt Show on the Salem Radio Network returns from break in 15 seconds. The Hugh Hewitt Show returns from break in 5 seconds.
Welcome back, America. Ben Domenench is with me, editor-at-large. Ben Domenench can be followed on X at @BDomenench. He's also a contributor at Fox News. I hope he's working this weekend. Ben, I need the senator to do one thing in this debate. It's on my must-do scorecard, which is we have heard again and again and again how the Republicans stopped the Democrats from fixing the border. Now, J.D. Vance has the benefit of being a senator and having been in the Republican conference when they sent off Jim Lankford to negotiate with the Democrats. Jim did the best he could. Senator Lankford is a very smart guy. He brought back a bill. It had 2 votes. Do you think J.D. Vance can explain that effectively and that it is a dodge for Kamala Harris and Tim Walz to blame a bill that never got anywhere near passing as the missed opportunity to solve the border crisis?
I think he can, and I think that this is something that, any Republican senator worth its salt should be able to explain effectively in this cycle, especially those who are running for re-election and who are, facing the challenges of this debate, across the country. That's something that I think has to be done and has to be, really hammered into, because the Democrats have been, I think, quite successful at spinning this idea that somehow it's Republicans' fault that their policy was the policy that it was for the first 3.5 years of this administration. And now turning around and saying, well, but we've got it under control because we're Democrats and we did it without the Republicans who were beholden to Donald Trump and we're trying to just use this against us. That's something that I think they have been prosecuting in the public in a way that is perhaps going to convince low information voters and people who don't really know that the way that this works and understand how this bill would not have solved anything. It actually would have made some things worse. And I think that that's something that needs to be brushed back against. And I think that J.D. can do that effectively. I think that Tim Walz has only demagogued on this issue. Everything that I've heard from him has just been off the Democrat talking point sheet. And he's obviously not someone who's particularly comfortable talking about the border in a larger context. He's made some errors over the course of this when he's trying to talk about it. And so I think that that's something where the advantage can be pressed.
Now, our friend Matt Continetti, our Green Room buddy, Matt Continetti, was on the panel with me last night on Special Report. He got the question about Kamala going to the border today. Here's what he said last night on Thursday night, cut 28.
She heads to Arizona tomorrow and is going to head to a border stop. How will that go? Will hanging the lantern there on that issue, which is perceived as a vulnerability, somehow solve that issue?
I don't think it's a smart move, Brett. I think it'll only remind people that she was put in charge of resolving the border crisis at the outset of this administration, and it only grew worse over time. Immigration is Donald Trump's signature issue. That's not where Kamala Harris should
Ben, Chris Matthews came up with the famous phrase, hang a lantern on your problem, and that usually is true, but I don't think it's true here. I agree with Matt that her showing up at the border now is another, maybe she just got lousy campaign advisors, but do you agree with Continetti and me, or do you think it's a bold move by a surging vice president?
I think it's an error in part because it gives journalists a reason to write about her own failure to deal with this, including people who normally want to avoid talking about the border because they understand that when they talk about it, it benefits Republicans and it benefits Donald Trump. And so that's something that I think she should have avoided. In the late stages of a campaign like this, you want to be emphasizing your strongest aspects. If she had a primary campaign, if she had come through this in a traditional way, you would have wanted to do this perhaps back in the spring, just to be able to check off the box and say that, and refer back to it in the fall. But at this stage in the campaign, I think it's an error, and I don't think her campaign is that impressive, to be quite honest. I'm not impressed by her ads. I'm not impressed by their approach to these interviews. I'm not impressed by anything that they've really done. And in fact, I think I may have even said this to you before, Hugh. I thought we were going to get like the most Hollywood style produced campaign once she was elevated, and had all of these connections back to Hollywood and to California and to creative types, et cetera. Instead, I think it's been pretty lackluster, and it's not lived up to the threat that I thought was posed by elevating her in a way that could have produced a more passionate, perhaps, and an inspirational approach to campaigning. I think it's been a very typical Democrat campaign, and I think that this is another mistake that they're making.
I agree. I think she may be the most overrated candidate ever nominated. Dukakis always used to hold that position because people thought he was going to be great, and he had a 17-point lead coming out of the Democratic convention. But she's just terrible. She is a terrible candidate. I shudder for the country and the West if she becomes president. I'm talking about Israel and Ukraine with Ben during the break. Coming back with Megyn Kelly on the other side. Don't go anywhere, America. We'll post this part of our conversation on the podcast today at Highly Concentrated Q.
Portions of the Hugh Hewitt Show are brought to you in part by the Heritage Foundation.
I'm back now with Ben Domenench. Ben, last thing, I know that Margaret Brennan and Norah O'Donnell are hostile to J.D. Vance because I have seen Margaret Brennan be hostile to him. I'm hostile to his idea about Ukraine because I think we should flood Ukraine with everything because I think China is using Russia as a proxy against NATO, not us using Ukraine as a proxy against Russia. Be that as it may, they're going to come after him and they're going to quote Zelensky to him. You're too extreme. At that point, I want him to say, I'm going to talk about Israel, I'm going to talk about Ukraine, but I'm not going to do it in the context of clipped remarks. Israel needs our support 100%. We're cutting off intel, and we should only do what NATO does and nothing beyond. What do you think he should do when they quote Zelensky, as they will? I'm just making a prediction. They will quote Zelensky to J.D. Vance or to Tim Walz to use as a hammer against J.D. Vance.
I think that how JD navigates this issue could be really determinative in the debate. I also assume, by the way, that they will be echoing Kamala Harris's remarks about the Thurman situation on abortion in Georgia. The other thing that I think that he needs to do and needs to be mindful of in this context is that this is not a space for him to sort of go down his own rabbit holes of belief regarding policy. He is there as the representative, as the stand-in for Donald Trump. And so it's Trump's policies towards Ukraine that he ought to be defending as opposed to his own unique perspective on this. That's something, though, that I think is going to be a real challenge for him, and I think that he needs to put it in the context of what is in the best interest of America. I agree with you, Hugh, that frankly, this administration dragged its feet for far too long, that this war could have been ended more quickly, and that it could have been, essentially flooded with the kind of resources that they needed much earlier than how everything actually played out, which is very consistent with the Biden approach to foreign policy, by the way. And I think that Vance should be a critic of that and basically say, you did this in a way that essentially led to this war being continued without any real end in sight.
Ben, a very specific question, because before we run out of time, I last night on Special Report said, look, there have been two Russian invasions of Ukraine, in 2014 under Barack Obama and in 2018 under Joe Biden. In 2014, Obama sent blankets. When Trump was president, he sent anti-tank missiles, which saved them when they invaded a second time after the collapse of Afghanistan. So two invasions of Ukraine by Russia, both under Democrats. Kamala Harris is responsible. Tim Walz, you quit before you deployed. I don't know why you're telling anyone what to do about a war. How would you answer that? Would you adopt the history approach of Hugh Hewitt?
Yeah, I think that approach is something that can work. Of course, it's something that in the context of this is the best way to deal with the interviewers. I mean, with the moderators, because they are mindful of that history as well, and because frankly, I think it's a way to put them back on their heels. But you are completely correct that they are going to try to spin this in a way that makes him look like he's anti-American, anti-Ukrainian, and that he has sort of a fanciful view of the world. And I think that he needs to come back with it and say, no, I actually have the experience. I know what this is like. I actually deployed. I actually have been through this. I understand these issues, and you're the ones who are operating from a position that has no authority because you've been wrong so often, so frequently, and so continuously.
Okay, last prediction. I've got Cat Lady and they're eating the cats and dogs on my bingo card.
Yes,
it is irresponsible for these two, Norah O'Donnell and Margaret Brennan, to bring that up, but they will. I think they will. Do you think they will bring up both cat ladies and they're eating the cats and dogs?
Of course they will. Of course they will, because that's why you have. That's why you choose them to do this, by the way. It's why you choose them over someone like Don Dickerson. It's why you choose them over someone who's going to be, I think, more fair in terms of the approach and going to prioritize the things that the Americans care about. Instead, you pick two of your more biased anchors to do this. And I think that they, frankly, will be expected to do so by their friend group, and they won't be able to get brunch afterwards with them if they don't bring those up.
Ben Domenench, thank you. Follow Ben at BDomenench on X. Follow me to the next segment. Megyn Kelly gives advice to J.D. Vance about the debate. We'll play that excerpt from my long interview with her yesterday right after this.